session. We're super excited to offer this free community training in partnership with the Oakland Public Library, especially in honor of Small Business Month. This is something that we really thought would be a great offering for this month. So what we're going to start out today with is really just talking about who I am and what PTW is, and then we'll dive into the training a little bit. Next slide, please. Uh, can you hit presentation one more time? It slipped out. There you go. Perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Miriam. All right, so my name is Ronkevious Smalls, and I am the principal consultant and founder of Paving the Way Consultancy, also known as PTW. So we are located in Oakland, California, where we work with a lot of small businesses in a consulting capacity, specifically in HR. So right now we are really on this big push, like I was sharing a little bit earlier, with a small business month offering and making sure that we make education, specifically HR education, accessible to the community, because it is one of those things that sometimes seems like it's a little bit out of reach. In my organization, what we're trying to do is make sure that people can get access to that. And so we are doing things like this where we're offering these community trainings. So a little bit about my background. So I went to the University of South Florida, where I earned a bachelor's degree in leadership studies. After earning my degree in leadership studies, I started a consulting firm, PTW Consultancy, in 2014. And ever since then, it's really just been a smaller practice where I work, like I said, with a lot of small businesses. And after working over a number of years, I I went and earned a HR certification, specifically my Senior Professional in Human Resource certification through HRCI, which is an accrediting institution for human resource professionals. I am also a member, or excuse me, a adult mental health first aid certified professional. So what that basically means is I put mental health first when it comes to my practice in HR. So I'm an ally for mental health as well through SHRM. And like I said, that's just something that's really important to me. And that's something that I build into my practice. And you'll see that as we go through the presentation today, how we build in and take into consideration the whole person when it comes to HR. And originally I'm from Florida. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me. And yeah, next slide, please. All right, so we're going to start the training out with setting our intentions. So basically, what that means is I like to start out by setting the ground to say what it is and how we're going to go about today's training, right? First things first, the freedom of thought and expression. This is an interactive training. So what that means is feel free. If you have a thought, share that thought. If you want to express something, feel free, express it. I want you guys to feel comfortable to engage in the material, to be, involved in what it is that's going on today, right? Then also to explore your curiosity. There are going to be some topics that we talk about that may be new to you. There may be some topics that may not be new to you, but maybe you have a question about it. Feel free, ask that question. This is a free space to be able to enjoy yourself and also be able to just ask the questions that you may have out that's in your mind. Embrace unforeseen perspectives. We don't always think of everything. We may think we do, but we don't always do so. So it's okay if someone comes into the room with a different perspective than our own. Let's embrace that perspective. Let's embrace the unforeseen. Then also to really acknowledge what you would like to get out of this, right? As you're thinking about what we're discussing, as you're going through the training, what do you really want to get out of this? What are your intentions for showing up today? Literally let that sink in with you so that way you can see what it is that really matters to you most. Maybe not everything in the training is what you're looking for, but maybe you're looking for something specific, and that's okay. Allow yourself to acknowledge that and go through the training. And also give yourself grace. Again, these are going to be some new topics for some people, right? You're not going to know everything. There may be some things that we discuss that may make you feel a little bit more vulnerable, or that makes you feel as though, well, dog it, I should have thought of that. Give yourself the grace and the space to be able to say that, you know what, I didn't think of it, but I'm here in this training today so that I can learn. and have the conversation. Again, this is an interactive training. Feel free to engage with the material. Feel free to engage with me. Feel free to ask that question. If you don't feel comfortable asking the question out loud, that's okay. Put it in the chat. I promise you we'll get to it. But definitely, we want to set the intentions for today. We're setting our space and setting ourselves up for success as we go through today. All right. Next page. All right. So we're going to start the training out with a little bit of a warm up, right? We're going to ask yourself this question. Ask yourself this question. How are you a human resource? And I'll explain what that means while you think about that, right? So, human resources is about balancing operational success with human centered business practices. At its core, it's about being a resource for humans in the workplace. Apply that same mindset to yourself. How are you showing up every day as a resource to the people around you? Think about that. How are you a human resource to the people around you? Whether that be the way in which you work or the industry in which you work in, or whether that be your community service, what it is that you do. So I'll start out, right? So me, I feel like I'm a human resource because I'm giving community trainings, right, for free. To me, that's providing a resource to the small business community. And to me, that's very important. So to me, today, I'm choosing to show up as a human resource by being there for individuals who may not have access to this information. So, anybody else would like to share? How are you a human resource? Feel free. If you don't feel comfortable coming off mic to share, you can feel free to drop it in the chat. I'll give you some time. All right. No worries. It's totally fine. If no one wants to share, that's okay. Denise, I encourage others. I love that. That's a great way to definitely be a good human resource, right? Sometimes you just need that encouragement. Even like me, when I work in HR, right? There are days where individuals will literally come over to the office and just be like, today is just not a great day. And, maybe something happened at home and they're just trying to have a really good day. And that little bit of encouragement can really make a difference for that person. All right, I see a couple other things. Let's see what we have in the chat here. Being a wealth of knowledge on policies and procedures. Yes, definitely helpful. Whether you're helping your fellow colleagues out or whether you're helping, the business itself with those policies and those procedures, that's a great way to be a resource to people. Because I always like to say you should read your handbook, but I know not everyone reads the handbook. So definitely when you have someone in your corner that has read the handbook and understands it, it makes a major difference. I act as a resource for my newer colleagues in my profession. I love that. Definitely. Helping that person feel comfortable when they come into the room, that makes a major difference, right? With them feeling comfortable with doing the job because a new workspace can be intimidating. Providing a solution to women in, I don't know how to pronounce that. How do you,
That's
premenopause.
perimenopause.
Is that premenopause? I figured it out. Yes, thank you, Miriam. Premenopause. That is awesome. That is really great, especially for women's health. I love it when I hear that there are a lot of women advocates out there and women supports in the community. So I love that. Providing leadership and managing up or down if you work in a hierarchical organization. Calm during the storm. Definitely need that person, right? Especially in an ever-changing world, in an ever-changing environment, in an organization, there's definitely someone that's needed to maintain the calm and the peace. I love that. Thank you guys so much for sharing. These are all great things, right? Well, definitely how we show up every day to as a resource to each one of our fellow colleagues or even just in the workplace. I love this. So this is great. So thank you guys for sharing. All right, next slide. All right. So I wanted to start out the training with us discussing jurisdictions because that is a big part of business compliance in HR. So, as we really dive into this, there are going to be some things that we talk about specifically from a federal standpoint, and there are going to be things that we talk about from a California standpoint, right? So, as a business practice, when you're operating a business, you're subjected to those laws, those regulations for that business as it relates to where you're located, right? So you have three different jurisdictions typically. So you have federal, you have state, and you also have municipality, which they can be different, right? Sometimes they may have similar policies, similar regulations, but it may be a little bit different or a little bit more enhanced depending on where you're located. So just to be upfront, we're going to talk about federal and we're also going to talk about California state law. I will also share though, if you happen to be in another state other than California, I welcome you to this session and here's why. Because California labor laws are so, we're going to say judicious, and more favorable for employees, I always encourage my clients to follow the laws of a state municipality that's a little bit more strict than their own because that means that you'll always be ready and prepared, right? So like if you're operating in Florida, you know Florida and California are a little bit different, right? The lay of the land in Florida isn't as judicial as California, but if you happen to practice under California labor laws and things, you'll be prepared, right, for whatever comes your way in Florida. I'll share a little bit of a story about a time where I worked with the client, and essentially it was I had a client whose main office wasn't in Florida, particularly Miami, Florida. And then they had a employee or two over here in California. And out of nowhere, randomly, they got selected for an audit. And because they were selected for an audit in Florida, their records, though, because they had that employee in California, we had been practicing and using those good business behaviors, if you would, from being over in California with the larger majority of the population of Florida employees as well. And as a result of that, when it came down to that audit, we aced it. And we aced it because we had more information than we needed, more information than they asked for. And as a result of having more information, we were able to get through that audit successfully, right? And when they had questions that started to dig a little bit deeper, we had the data to show that we also kept along with those records and that information and could provide that to them, right? So in my opinion, I think this is a great opportunity for anyone who may not be operating in California, but still getting that knowledge and gaining that experience from this conversation. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to start today's conversation out with employment classifications. Next slide. So in this particular section, we're going to focus on three things. And before I dive into this slide, I'll share this a little bit with you. So we're going to dive in being able to understand the difference between an employee and an independent contractor. Also being able to understand the difference between a full-time employee and a part-time employees. Because those are three typical categories in which are easy to get wrong. And so we want to go ahead and get that information out there. So that way, when you're moving along and you're beginning to hire new people in your organization, you know exactly how they should be classified, right? And so, right, what we have in front of us is the FLSA employee assessment. So this is an actual assessment from the federal government that they have put out that says, all right, if you read through this and you make these determinations, this will let you know whether or not this individual should be labeled as an employee or if they should be labeled as an independent contractor, right? So the first thing that we want to look at is the opportunity for profit or loss depending on managerial skills, right? That's a mouthful. So what does that mean? Whether that worker negotiates their pay, decides to accept their declined work, if they should hire employees, should they purchase materials, realistically, what is it? It's looking at, is this person really contributing the majority of what is needed in order to do this job? Does this person has the ability to make independent oversight that benefits them in being able to complete that job? If the answer is yes, that person is then classified as an independent contractor under this particular classifications right here, opportunity for profit or loss, right? So that's one. So now we're going to also look at investments by the worker and the employer, right? So again, it's kind of similarly, who's investing most of the resources into this? This factor primarily looks at whether the worker makes investments that are capital or entrepreneurial in nature. If this person is making a decision or doing something that is entrepreneurial in order to accomplish a project or a task, that person may be classified as an independent contractor. All right, and then we're also going to look at perform the excuse me, the permit of the work relationship, right? So we're going to look at what type of relationship do we have here, right? So this factor primarily looks at the nature and length of the work relationship. Work that is sporadic or project based with a fixed end date or regular occurring fixed periods of work. Does this person show up to your office every day 9 to 5? If this person shows up every day 9 to 5 with a predictable schedule because you provided that person with that schedule and that person can't necessarily say, "Ooh, I can't work on Mondays," then that person may be an employee. Are we seeing the difference a little bit? We'll go through the rest of it, but are we seeing a little bit of the difference, right? So the difference is if this person isn't investing more into this project or into this task or into this company, that person may actually be an independent contractor. If this person doesn't have the ability to set their own schedule, then they may be an employee. That's a difference between what that looks like. Independent contractors have the opportunity to say, "Hey, unfortunately, I can't do work for you on Mondays. So therefore, I maybe Tuesday may work. And if Tuesday don't work, then we'll have to really figure it out," right? That independent contractor has the ability to say when they are available and when they're ready to work. Whereas an employee doesn't necessarily have that dictation, right? That employee gets that schedule, and the expectation is that they work that schedule. And then we're going to look at the nature and degree of control. This factor primarily looks at the level of control the potential employer has over performance of the work and the economic aspect of the working relationship. Relevant factors include whether the potential employer controls hiring, firing, scheduling, pricing, or pay rates, right? So if we think back into that first one that we looked at, the opportunity for profits or loss depending on managerial skills, right? And that one is said if the individual if whether or not an individual has the ability to hire others to work alongside them in order to accomplish a task or accomplish a project specific to the company, right? And if we're looking at the nature and degree of control, it's kind of saying the same thing, huh? Right? So if the person doesn't have the ability to hire, fire, schedule, pricing, or pay rates or whatnot, then that person may be an employee. Again, seeing the difference here, a little bit of a difference between whether or not someone is an independent contractor versus an employee. Whether work performed is integral to employer's business. The primary factor for this one is looks at whether the work is critical, necessary, or central to the potential employer's principal business, which indicates employee status, right? So if you've hired someone, right, and you've hired them to make widgets for you, and the whole premises of your business is making widgets, that person may be an employee. Now, there are circumstances where you can outsource like some of this work to other companies and other individuals where they may not be an employee. But ultimately, this is one factor that could determine whether or not this person is an employee if the work is crucial, necessary, and is a central function of what it is that you do. So if you're a widget business and you hire someone to do widgets for you, and again, you manage their schedule, you're managing what the rate of pay is and how much everything is costing, and whether or not they can bring on additional help, all of those things come into play, right? And if it all comes into play in a way in which it may look like this person actually is an employee. Hopefully that made sense. And then the last one is skill and initiative. This factor primarily looks at whether the worker uses their own specialized skills together with the business planning and effort to perform the work and support or grow a business, right? How integral is this person to the function of this business, right? Is this person making decisions that are for the business? Or is this person making decisions that are in tangent with the business? If this person is making a decision for the business, that may be an employee. If this person is making a decision that is in tangent with the business, maybe they are an independent contractor. So those are some factors that we really want to look at, and that is what the government looks at. Those six factors right there, that is exactly what the government is looking at, and that is how they're discerning between whether or not someone is an employee or an independent contractor. So using that same logic, we're going to work on a few scenarios to determine is this individual a employee or an independent contractor. But before we go to the next slide, I just wanted to give an opportunity to see if anyone had any questions. And if not, that's totally fine. All right. We can shift to the next slide, Miriam. All right. So going back to that interactive piece, this is the part where we get to be a little bit more interactive. And again, you don't necessarily have to take yourself off mute. Feel free to drop the answer in the chat box as well. So independent contractor or employee? A landscaper performing ongoing work for a property management company who outlines expectations for quality and timing. The worker has a consistent weekly schedule. The worker markets their services, determines their rate of pay, chooses which property to landscape, and hires assistants when needed. Do we think that this person is an independent contractor or an employee? I like this. Independent contractor question mark. All right. I like it. Okay. So this person would be classified as an independent contractor, and here's why. Because the worker markets their services, determines their rate of pay, chooses which properties to landscape, and hires assistants when needed. An employee cannot make that decision on behalf of the company typically, right? Unless that is a big part of their job, which again, those are other factors that go into it, like we discussed. But ultimately, because this person has the opportunity to market their services and also determine their rate of pay, that makes them an independent contractor. Any questions around that? Good job, everyone. All right, next slide, Mary. I think you went two slides. One more back. There you go. All right, next one's up. A graphic designer performs ongoing work for a design firm. The firm provides an office space, equipment, software, and a steady flow of projects. The firm manages marketing and client relations. The designer follows a general consistent work schedule, but has flexibility in how they complete their work and occasionally uses their own tools for certain projects. Is this person an employee or an independent contractor? Okay. All right. All right. And a couple more seconds. All right. So would anyone like to tell me why and how they knew it was an employee? And feel free, you can drop it in the chat or you can take yourself off mute. But how did you know that this was an employee? Yes. All right. The firm provides things to the graphic designer, work schedule. Yes, those are all key things. The firm manages marketing and the client relations stood out to me. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Those are those determining factors because the firm is doing that on behalf of this person and providing the tools, excuse me, not the tools, but providing the software, right? And a steady flow of projects that makes that person an employee. Let's see. The tools provided by the company and the company manages the client relations. Yes, that person does not have to go out and seek their own clientele. They get a steady stream of clientele from the firm. Good job, everyone. All right, and we got one more. You can slip next screen. Yes, you are correct. They are not paying for their own office space. All right, next one. A cook prepares specialty meals for an entertainment venue for select events throughout the year. The venue reaches out when events are scheduled, and the cook is often invited back based on past performance. At the same time, the cook markets their service to other venues and private clients, accepts work from multiple sources, and can decline requests from the entertainment venue due to other commitments. Is this person an independent contractor or an employee? I like these expeditiousness that you guys responded. This is dope. Yes, yes. Everyone is on the same page here. This is an independent contractor. This person has the ability to decline a schedule. This person does get a steady stream of work from this particular venue, but they also have work at other event places and things like that. So that makes that person an independent contractor. All right, good job, everyone. Give yourself a pat on the back. That was awesome. All right, man, we'll chug along. So now we've talked about the difference between an independent contractor and an employee, right? So the next thing that we're going to talk about, what is the difference between a full-time employee versus a part-time employee? So I will start this conversation out by saying, under the federal guidance, there is no specific classification for full-time versus part-time. However, there may be a difference in certain states and in certain municipalities. California doesn't have one, to my knowledge, doesn't have a specific classification for what does it mean and say you have to meet all of these criteria in order to be considered full-time versus part-time. Those are things that are typically set in good faith by the employer, right? However, I'm going to share some typical behaviors. So these are things that are commonly seen as practices for classifying someone that is full-time versus part-time. And I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, feel free to, let me know and I can better explain. So again, just so you know, under there's only certain circumstances, and there's no circumstance on a federal level where there's a specific classification for full-time. Actually, I'm going to retract that statement. There's only one classification where there is for a full-time, but generally speaking, there is no federal classification for full-time versus part-time. But we'll talk about that one exception. All right. So full-time generally works 35 or more hours per week, typically has an exempt employment status, receives employment benefits, so medical, vision, dental, travel, comp, any of those things, right? And so some common roles that may fit someone in a full-time capacity could be someone operating as a operations manager, a director, or even a supervisor, right? Those are things that can commonly be considered full-time employment. Part-time employment generally looks like someone who works less than 35 hours per week. They're typically classified as a non-exempt employee. They have flexible scheduling options, so they're a little bit more flexible in their abilities to work. And some common roles in which you may see someone that's in a part-time capacity would be something like a bartender, retail associate, a line cook, some things that are a little bit more frontline. Typically, you can see those as part-time classifications, right? So, all right. I see we got a question. What is the difference between exempt and non-exempt? Don't jump the gun. I got you. 1 second. All right, Miriam, if you press the next, that some shit pop up. There we go. Exempt status versus non-exempt status. So an exempt status, overtime pay rule does apply. So basically, the federal government says that if a person works more than 40 hours in a given week, they are eligible to receive overtime pay, right? If that person is eligible to receive overtime pay, that person is considered to be non-exempt. But if that person should not be eligible for overtime pay, so someone who is salary, for instance, right? Typically, those individuals who are salary are exempt. There are cases in which they cannot, in which they may not be, but for the most part, they are exempt. Middleman just is a scam. That's funny. So hopefully that makes a little bit of a difference in explaining exactly what it is. Hopefully that does a good job of explaining the difference between someone that is exempt and non-exempt. Does that answer your question? Thumbs up if it does. All right, no worries. I'm going to assume that it is, and if not, feel free to drop an additional question, and I'll do my best to explain. And I also see, is it tax related? Um, yes, it is tax related, but on a different in a different way than we're going to talk about in today's session, but it does still have some payroll implications as well. So I was sharing a little bit earlier that there's one exception to that classification rule, right? So I was saying, technically, under the federal guidance and regulations, there is no classification of what exactly someone who is full-time versus part-time, right? The only classification they have is between whether or not someone is an independent contractor or an employee. However, there's one exception to the rule. So under the ACA, what is it? The Affordable Cares Act. When it comes to an employer who has more than 50 full-time employees, there is a requirement that that employer submits a report regarding different benefits offerings and things like that, right? But again, that only applies to employers with 50 or more employees. And again, that also is very specific to the benefits. So there's a lot more that goes into it. But for a general standpoint, there is no official federal regulation or guidance around what's the difference between a full-time and part-time employee. Hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, just let me know. All right. And we can go to the next slide, Miriam. Thank you. All right. So just as a quick follow-up to what we were just talking about, can a part-time employee be paid a salary? This is actually a trick question. I want to see whether or not you get this one because we did not talk about this one. But what do you think? Can a part-time employee be paid a salary? All right. Okay. Great follow-up question. I like that. So, in order to answer your question, Danielle, I'm going to give the answer to the question. And the answer is yes. Can a part-time employee be paid a salary? Yes, they can. A part-time individual can be paid a salary, but it will be prorated. So it won't be full out salary, such as like a full-time person, right? So it wouldn't be at a standard 40 hours a week, 80 hours every 2 weeks, or however it is that that's set up amongst the company, right? Essentially, if that person says that, all right, as a part-time employee, I'm going to only work 20 hours, a week for you, then that person can technically negotiate a salary and that salary and that person would be only paid a portion of that salary that reflects the 20 hours a week in which they work. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, let me know. But yes, the answer is yes, a part-time employee can be paid a salary. Can you hit the next button for me? The answer should pop up. There you go. All right. Yes, exactly. That's exactly what it's like when you cancel early and then they tell you, all right, cool, we're going to charge you for the 15 days in which you use and we'll give you the rest back. Essentially, it's the same way. And when you do it in a payroll perspective, there's a way that you'll do it in the system where they only do a prorated payment. All right. Next question. Can a full-time employee be paid hourly? We may or may not know the answer to this one. All right. All righty. I like it. Interesting. Okay. No, but you can break down their hourly rate. I think I understand your thinking, Danielle. Um, so the answer is yes. And here's why. So I'm going to find the words to best explain this. When it comes to salary, you are saying as an employee that you're going to work for this company no matter how many hours it takes for you to complete your work, you're going to complete your work in an infinite amount of time, whatever that means, right? That is your commitment. You're saying that, yes, I agree that you only pay me $45,000 a year, even if that means that I'm going to work in 80 hours a week, right? I know that I'm only going to make 45K a year, right? That is your commitment. As an employee, we'll get there. All right. So as an employee, excuse me, as an hourly employee, you could then say, well, you know what? If I have to work 80 hours a week, you're going to pay me X amount of money per hour, even if that goes over that 40-hour threshold, whatever that means, right? And so I think that is a great way to look at the difference. Rather than looking at it breaking down their hourly rate, look at it from a perspective of an employee, right? If it's going to take me a lot of time to do this work, would I rather be paid a salary or would I rather be paid an hourly rate in order to accomplish that job? And as a full-time employee, you can make that discernment, and you can also make that discernment with the employer as to whether or not what fits better. And again, there's no precedent under the federal laws that says that there's any classification. So therefore, you can have that conversation between you and the employer to determine what's best. And I hopefully that makes sense. If I miss work, can they dock my salary? No sick leave, no vacation. I'm going to say let's go offline because there may be more to that question, and there's some behavioral things that may go into it to answer that one. I'm happy to answer that one, but we can do that one offline because there may be a little bit more that goes into that, and I don't want to give a blanketed answer for that statement, if that makes sense, and I hope that's fair. Um, All right. Miriam, if you would be so kind just to hit the button. All right. And then we're going to do the third question. No, no, you gave the answer away. It's okay. Does being an hourly full-time employee mean an employee is automatically classified as exempt? Um, and the answer is no. Full-time employees can be classified as non-exempt when the appropriate criteria are met. There are specific criteria that do have to be met in order for that to happen, but the answer is essentially no for that. All right. Feeling good, everyone? Thumbs up if we're feeling good. Thumbs up if we feel like we're learning something. Awesome. Love it. Love it. All right, perfect. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about employment records. So employment records are essentially the files that your employer or you as the employer has on you, right? And so we're going to talk about what type of records are out there, how they should be maintained, how they should be stored, and what should be in these individual files. So we're going to go through that a little bit just to talk about it. And yeah, Mary, you can go to the next slide, please. All right, where should employee records be stored? So, when I work with my clients, I recommend a four folder file system. So what does that mean? That means each employee has four folders. It sounds like a lot, I know. And if you're thinking about actual folders, then you're just like, oh my gosh, where are we going to put all these folders and all these trees that we're killing, right? Doesn't have to be that way necessarily. You can definitely use a secure system to be able to store your files, right? So that's something that you can definitely work with an IT person or even an HR person or HR consultant to be able to really determine what that system looks like for you. So essentially, what those four folders should look like. There should be a folder for personal files. So that's anything from employee records and performance. There should be another folder that is confidential medical and leave files. So think anything related to leaves of absence, medical records and accommodations, FMLA, CFRA, any of those things, right? That is that file. Then you also want to have a file specific for payroll and compensation. And then you also want to have a file for employment eligibility verifications. And what that basically means is your I-9 documents, right? So when you first bring an employee into your company, one of the things that you have to do within the first 3 days of hiring is to make sure that you have verified that they are eligible to work in the United States. And so that is where that information in that form is going to go. And as a nice fact for everyone, under California Labor Code, 1198.5, employers must maintain personal records tied to performance and employment decisions and allow employees to access them. Now, this is something very specific to California. So when an employee comes up to you and says, "Hey, I would like to look at all the files that you have on me," you can let them know, "All right, I can share with you your personnel file, which contains your employee records and your performance." So again, that's something that is specific to California. So keep that in mind as an employer. If an employee comes to you and asks you for their files, you are required to provide that to them. And there is a time frame and all the thing that goes along with that. If you're interested in exploring what that looks like and what those requirements are, we can definitely do that. But ultimately, do know that when an employee does come to you and ask you for that file, you are required to provide that to them. Now, granted, it's not all four files, it's only the personnel file, right? So if you have a confidential medical and leave file, payroll compensation, and employment eligibility verifications, those files are not required to be turned over, but the personnel file is. And that also goes into one of the reasons why I recommend having four different files, right? Because since you are required to hand over those files and documents, it will be best to not have mixed information across multiple of those files because then that do presents a bit of a risk for the company. So just something to keep in the back of your mind as you're working on your filing system and organizing that. I recommend that four file system, one that's for personnel files, another for confidential medical leave files, payroll and compensation, employment and eligibility verifications. Next slide, please. All right. So, along with that four file system, I have created a self audit test that allows for any small business owner to self audit themselves, right? So essentially, you're self auditing your files. So let's say I just told you about this four file system. You're not 100% sure where you want to start with this or even how to implement this into what it is that you're working on. This is where you'll start. This self-audit test will allow you to see where you are and see what it is that you're missing or you may not be missing, right? To be able to actually execute that four-file system. So point number one of the 4-point self-audit test is a completeness. Is everything required there? The perfect example for this is the I-9 forms, right? So that is that verification that you have to do once you've hired someone within the first 3 days. So let's say someone comes in and they bring you a copy of their passport, right, as a verification document, right? Do you have all the boxes on that I-9 document filled out correctly? Are they signed by all the appropriate people? Is it a complete document? If someone walked in today and said, "Hey," if a auditor walked in today and said, "Hey, show me your I-9 files," can you say that they are all completed? So you want to go through your files, go through your documents and see, are all these documents completed? Do I have signatures in the appropriate areas where I need signatures? Sharing a little story, I remember when I was working in Massachusetts, I was working for a hotel. And one of the first things that I did when I went in as the HR manager was look at our files, and specifically our I-9 files. And there was a lot of things going on that should not have been going on there. We had I-9 documents that were filled out by us, but that weren't signed by employees. We had documents that were signed by employees, but they were not signed by us. So, if an auditor had walked in that day, I would have been in a lot of trouble, and the company would have been too, right? So it's very important that we look for that completeness and making sure that we did everything to the T that we need to in order to keep ourselves in the clear, right? So looking at that completeness. Then we're also going to look at accuracy. Are our documents current and consistent? All right. Is the information that we put on that official document, is it true or is it not true? Did we verify this or did we not verify this, right? Those are the type of questions you want to be asking yourself when you're looking at the accuracy. Can we, in good faith, say that we did everything that we needed to do in order to make sure that this document was filled out to the best of our abilities? If you can say that, then accuracy is good, right? But you want to scrutinize your documents like that, all the ones that you have in all 4 folders, and make sure that they are accurate. And if they're not accurate, do whatever needs to be done in order to make sure, of course, legally, ethically, and morally correct, whatever needs to be done in order to make sure you accomplish that. And then also to separation. Why do we have 4 different folders? Because information needs to be separated. The individual who has access to compensation information may not need to have access to that person's medical records, whatever, right? That manager who has access to the performance reviews doesn't need to have access to that person's I-9 document, right? So having those 4 different folders allows for you to be able to separate that information so that whoever has access to it are the persons that have access to it. And which goes into the fourth, which is access control, right? If that person doesn't need access to it, they should not have access to it. A good example of this is, right, in a company, sometimes a company may have multiple owners, and those multiple owners may do multiple things within the company, right? But let's say there are 2 owners at company A. And one owner manages the HR and the other owner manages the sales, right? Does the sales owner need to have access to all of the employee files? The answer to that is no. If the owner only focuses on sales, there's no need for that person to have access to someone's I-9 compensation and other things. Yes, they are owner of the company. Yes, they may want it. However, do they need it in order to perform their job? They do not. So in those instances, it is great to make sure that there's a separation in documents, and also making sure that there's access control, and those individuals who need it are the ones that have access to it. Does that make sense to everyone? Nice. All right. Sounds good. All right. And next slide. All right. And a recommendation. I almost forgot about that. One of my recommendations is review employee files for discrepancies every 90 days. So every quarter, you should be reviewing employee files. Just literally go through it, select, 1 or 2. Even if you have a bigger organization or a bigger company, let's say you have more like 20 employees, right? And going through all 20 of these employee folders is a lot for you to do every quarter. All right. Well, then select 1 to 2 every quarter, or maybe 5 to be better odds, right? Select up to 5 of those folders that are random and say, all right, I'm just going to check for completeness. I'm going to check for accuracy, separation. I'm going to look at access control. I'm going to do 5 of these employees every 90 days. So that way, by the end of the year, I've accomplished all 20. And that becomes a standard practice, and something that you'll begin to do more consistently, right? And then also, too, you'll be on top of your game. You won't have to worry about whether or not you're missing documents, or whether or not there's not a file, but a document in the incorrect folder, right? So doing that is something that becomes doing that allows for you to be audit ready, essentially. All right, next slide. All right, so diving a little bit deeper into these folders, right? So we talked about having folder one, or excuse me, the four folders, and now we're going to talk about what actually needs to go into these folders using the perspective of the audit, right? So folder one is your personnel file. So in the personnel files, we want to keep employment and performance related documents. So some common things that we would see in that would be an application and resume. Make sure that we have the offer letter or offer letters should that person have been with the company for a while and have been promoted. We want to make sure that we have all of the offer letters since the beginning of that person's inception at the company. You want to make sure that there are job descriptions. And also you want to make sure those job descriptions are signed. That makes a big difference later on down the line, right? Do you want to have performance reviews as you're having these conversations and as you're realigning that person to your expectations or you're praising that person for all the good work they're doing? You want to make sure that goes into that performance part of that folder, right? You want to make sure that you've gotten a track record of how this person is doing while under your tutelage. And then also too, simple disciplinary actions are documented, facts only. So what that basically means is that if there was a issue where you needed to have a more stern conversation or serious conversation with an employee, you want to make sure that that information is documented, right? You want to make sure that that's also in that folder. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and once we get to the performance management section. But as far as it goes for as it relates to the file itself, when those type of things happen, when you begin to document those will go into the personnel file. And also too, as a part of the edit, excuse me, as a part of your audit, no medical information should be in this file. Again, clear separation, a clear delineage between medical information and personnel information, right? We want to make sure that only the employment and performance information is in this folder. If it's medically related, we want it to go into the appropriate folder. And some common red flags that we see verbal warnings with no written records. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in performance management. We all are guilty of doing it if you are supervised individuals. Sometimes you'll have a conversation with someone where you're realigning them to your expectations, right? And it's just a verbal, it's nothing too crazy, right? So you just want to have that conversation, say, hey, I noticed that you are putting the pen on the desk over here when the pen should go over here, right? This is me just giving you a warning. Please don't do it again. This is the appropriate place to do it, right? Whatever that conversation may look like, it's still great to document that you had that conversation. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit further once we get to performance management. And also to manager notes stored in email instead of file. I can't tell you how many of my clients actually do this and how it actually bites them in the butt. When you get something in email, by all means, feel free, print it out, store it, do whatever you need to do to get it out of your email and into the appropriate folder. As we can all imagine, we get thousands, well, not thousands, maybe, but like hundreds of emails like a day, right? Things happen. You're going to lose it. You're going to forget about it. You may archive it. You may put it into a folder that you totally forgot you put it into. Rather than even risk it, go ahead as soon as you get it, take it out of your email, put it into the appropriate folder, whatever that means, right? And then medical notes accidentally ending in performance documents. Again, make sure there's a clear delineation between medical notes and records and making sure that they're in the appropriate file that's needed. All right. And next folder, next slide. And folder number two, confidential medical and leave files, right? So we're going to talk about those medical records. And that I was making a clear distinction about how we should make sure they're not in file number one or folder number one, right? So folder number two, confidential medical and leave file. So in these folders, typically you will have your ADA accommodations, should that person have an accommodation on file. If FMLA is applicable to your organization, and if it's something that that person has, then those documents will be in this file as well. And CFRA, which is California Family Rights Act, though similar to FMLA but specific to California, any of those documents should be in that file as well. They should not fall into that person's personnel file. They should only be in the confidential medical leave file. And again, confidential. If that person should have any doctor's notes or anything that needs to be documented by the company, it should go into this file. Leave approval. So let's say this person needed to have some time off in order to get a medical procedure, right? Whatever that is, that information that's between the employee and the company needs to be in this folder. Records are stored with restricted access. Only those who need to know knows. Going back to that example that I was using earlier about the two owners, right? If that owner is only focusing on sales and has no job responsibilities related to managing the employee workforce, that person doesn't need to have access to the medical and leave files, right? That is a great way to look at that. And again, just some common red flags we see over here. We've talked about the email thread. Again, if accommodation happened, make sure it's in the appropriate folder and making sure that HR representatives or whoever is managing that HR part of the organization are not sharing information that they should not be sharing. All right, and we'll go on to folder number 3. All right, so folder number 3, we're gonna do payroll and compensation, right? So think all things related to payroll about that person's pay rate, that person's timesheet, wage statement. So when you think about wage statement, think about W-4s. W-4s are the documents that you sign to say that, all right, this is how much money I want the government to take out of my check every month for taxes. Any legal withholding. So think there's any garnishments on this person's wages or whatnot. These are documents that'll be stored in this folder as well. The records are retained for a minimum of 4 years. That is a very big distinction with this particular folder. So you will keep this information for 4 years, whether that person remains at your company or whether that person leaves your company. You keep this information for 4 years, so that way you can always go back to it should you ever need to. If the government ever comes knocking at your door and says, hey, we want to audit information from 3 years ago, you having those records for 4 years, make sure that you can provide and produce anything that the government is asking for. So that is also something specifically related to the payroll and compensation file. So common red flags we see with this particular folder is verbal pay agreements not documented. Like one of the things that I've seen is when we'll call them backroom deals are made, right? You make a backroom deal and you and this person have agreed that they're going to perform a service for X amount of money, but there was never an agreement. It's not the best practice. If you make an agreement, go ahead, put it in writing, and then if it's related to compensation and payroll specifically to that person performing services at your company, this is the folder that you want to put it in. Missed time records for hourly staff. This is a big one in California. A lot of employers in California actually see more lawsuits from time and wage mishaps than anything else, right? So one of the things that I always encourage employers to do is make sure you have your timesheets and make sure those timesheets are put in the appropriate places, right? So this would be an appropriate place to make sure you have a copy of those timesheets at all times. And inconsistent pay change approvals. Let's say that, Jim Bob Jim has been at your company for the last 2 years and he's done an awesome job. And you decided that you're going to promote him now to being the lead of the workforce, whatever that means. And now, as a result of him going to being a lead, he's no longer making $22 an hour. Now he's making 25. But you forgot to document that, right? That's a red flag. That is how you fail the audit, and we don't want that to happen. So what are we encouraging? We're encouraging when you make that promotion of Jim Bob Jim, that you document it and put that that pay rate change information in this folder. That is very important, so that way you can always keep track and record of that if you should ever need it. Hopefully that all makes sense. And if it doesn't, again, feel free conversation. If you have any questions, just drop them in the chat as we're moving along in the training. All right. Next slide, please. And that fourth and last folder, employment eligibility verification. So what this folder contains every employee has a completed I-9. So essentially in this folder, what you're making sure is that every employee has an I-9. That is a very big deal. It is very common to see employers hit with an egregious amount of fines related to I-9. It is the easiest way to have the government come knocking at your door, and it's also the easiest thing to have the government not knocking at your door, right? But it's really about making sure it's completed, making sure that it's accurate, and making sure that all the information that needs to be there is there. And then also too, one of the things that we'll talk about too is what does that retention rule look like, right? But ultimately, the goal is to make sure that every single employee in your company has an I-9 accounted for. So if you have 40 employees accounted for at your organization, then you should have 40 I-9s in a folder, right? So if you don't have 40, then you know you're missing someone. So that means you need to do a little bit of a thorough audit. Forms are stored separately from personnel files. Again, I-9 documents should go into a folder of its own. There should be no other things in this folder other than things that are related to employment eligibility verifications. So for I-9, that can be things like, I'll use this as an example. I'll say this, right? So that same company that I was at in Massachusetts working with the hotel, not only did we hire within the states, but we also hired individuals who worked in other countries, right? And so we would employ them to come and work for us during the summer. And so they would be classified under a different type of visa. And when that happened, there's different rules and regulations that are related to that when it goes to their I-9. And so they will come with specific forms from the Department of Homeland Securities, right, that we have to keep in that folder as well. So in situations like that, what is really important is making sure that that folder contains all things related to the employment eligibility verification, and those visa documents are some things that we do keep in the folder. And then also to the retention rule. So from the date of hire plus 3 years or 1 year after termination, whichever is later, that is how much time you need to keep your files for, right? So let's say that you hired Julie, right? And Julie has now been at your company for the last 3 years. 3 years ago, you did her I-9 document. And now you may be looking at, do I need to do this again? Which goes to the fourth bullet, re-verification. So now that Julie has been with your company for 3 years, that means that it's time to re-verify Julie's I-9 documents. So that means that going again with that retention rule in that re-verification, they kind of work one and the same. If Julie's been there for 3 years, then you want to make sure that you've re-verified and also make sure that all those documents are up to snuff. However, let's say Julie was hired on in January of this year, and Julie wind up being with the company until January of next year. That means a year after next year, for a whole year, so between 2027 to 2028, you will need to be keeping Julie's records, even though she's no longer at the company. Hopefully that made sense. And if it didn't make sense, please let me know. But essentially, the rule is if the person is with you continuously for 3 years, re verify, retain that information, make sure that you have it. If that person has left your company, whatever, for whatever reason, a year after that date of them leaving, you must maintain those records. So going back to the idea, Julie was hired on this year, January of 2026. Julie left, and let's say January is going to leave in January of 2027. That means you must maintain those documents until January of 2028. Seems like 2 years, seems like a long time. Realistically, it's not. And I hope it does make a little bit of sense. If it doesn't, feel free to drop a question in the chat so that way I can better explain it. Some common red flags, like we talked about, incomplete I-9 forms. Just want to make sure you have those complete. Untimely re-verification, again, 3 years. If Julie's been with the company for 3 years, that means it's time to renew her I-9. I-9 forms and supporting documents are stored in inappropriate folders. Again, they should only be stored in the employment eligibility verification folder. That is it. All right, before we shift gears, I'm just going to ask, are there any questions? Thumbs up if you feel good. Drop questions in the chat box if you have any questions. Thank you, Denise. I appreciate that. All right. All right, that one came out a little bit weird, but I'll explain what that slide is. So essentially, what this slide is just a reminder of what I call my 4-4-4 rule, right? You need four folders, you have four audit points, and you have 4 years, right? And this is something that is very specific to California, generally speaking, right? Generally speaking, in California, it is a best practice to maintain all records for 4 years. Again, I know we talked about with the I-9 documents and how there's a year rule for if a person is terminated. In my opinion, go with the 4 year rule. You will never have to worry about not having anything should anyone come knocking and asking any questions, right? The ultimate goal here is to make sure that you have that information and you can pull that data and information if you should ever need to. Um, we'll go to the next slide. All right. And now we're going to have a little bit of fun. So, where does it go? And so, where does it belong? This will be a chance for you to check in to see if you understood exactly what we were talking about here. So, we're going to see which corresponding boxes go with one another, right? So, which box on the left hand side goes with the box on the right hand side. And so, I'm going to start out and say, where does it belong? If you have a written warning, which folder does it belong in? And feel free to drop the answer in the chat when you're ready. All right. Any other guesses? Okay. Personnel. All right. Second one. Give a couple more seconds, see if there's any others. Perfect. You guys are correct. That written warning will go in the personnel file. If you hit the arrow, it'll pop up, Miriam. Perfect. All right. Next one, pay stubs. Which folder does or file does pay stubs go into? All right. Payroll and compensation. Payroll. Okay. Any others? I like it. Couple more seconds for anyone else. All right. You guys are correct. It goes in payroll and compensation. All right. In that third one, accommodation requests. Which folder do accommodation requests go in? Okay. Medical. Confidential medical. All right. Any others? Okay. Confidential. All right, and you guys would be correct. It goes into the confidential medical and leave file. Any accommodation requests or any interactive process, and we'll talk about exactly what that means a little bit later in the training. But that accommodation request definitely goes in that confidential medical and leaves file. All right, now the fourth one, a time off request that is non-medically related. Where does that go? Okay, employment eligibility. Personnel question mark. All right, I like it. Couple more seconds for any others. That time off request will go in the personnel file. And here's why, because it's non-medically related. So time off requests are considered to be related to your performance. So therefore it goes into your personnel file. If it were a time off request related to a medical need, then it would go into the confidential medical and leaves file. As far as the employment eligibility file, the only documents that will go into the employment eligibility files are documents related specifically to the I-9 for employment verifications. That is it. Good job, everyone. Give yourself a pat on the back. All right, and we're going to keep chucking along. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about hiring employees. All right, so now you've grown your business and you're ready to hire an employee. What does that look like for you? Next slide. So, what I always like to share with my clients is a sample hiring process, right? And of course, quite naturally, you can determine what this looks like at your company and what you want this to be for your company. Ultimately, the goal of this is to provide you with a sample of what this process could be like and how you can navigate this process when you're ready to start the hiring process. So, the hiring process, from my perspective, includes a recruiting phase, a phone screening phase, an interview with the hiring manager phase, a contingent offer of employment, pre-employment screening, and first day of employment. Um, I like to say that ultimately, depending on which type of position you're hiring for, I like to aim for having the process done within a matter of 2 weeks. If it's a frontline position, so like let's say I'm hiring someone who's going to be working in my retail space to work my cash register, right? I should be able to find someone in 2 weeks, in my opinion. By going through this process, I should be able to have someone in the door in no time. Now, if it's a management or a director level position, it may take a little bit longer and there may be a little bit more intricacies that are in this process. But even then, ultimately, my recommendation is no more than 4 months. You shouldn't have anyone going through the hiring process in no more than 4 months. Excuse me, 4 weeks. I said 4 months, Jesus. 4 weeks, no more than 4 weeks. If you have someone going through the process more than 4 weeks, to me, that becomes a very labor intensive a process, and also to your running a risk of actually losing those candidates because they may have found employment elsewhere. So, in my opinion, stick to a simple hiring process. You go through the 6 steps, and you should be able to get someone in the door in no time, right? Maintaining a simple yet effective hiring process is key. It is gold, and it's definitely something you want to keep in mind. All right, next slide. So, what does recruiting candidates entail? What does that look like? So you're ready to start recruiting someone to get into this position, to do this work for you. What does that look like? So, one thing that you would want to have is a job description. You want to define exactly what is this person doing. Yes, I know that I need someone to run my cash register at my retail front, but what is this person actually going to be doing aside from just managing the cash register? And that is where that job description comes into play. That's when you have the opportunity to spell out word for word exactly what does this position looks like. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along in the training as well too. And I'll give you a sample of a job description, and we'll work through that a little bit. Also, too, this is something that is very specific to California. Pay transparency. So in California, we have the Pay Transparency Act. So essentially, that requires you as an employer to share information around pay and compensation, even as it relates to folders and things like that. There are some connections with the Pay Transparency Act as it relates to that. But specifically talking about it from the recruiting standpoint, if you are an employer that has more than 15 employees in the state of California, you are required to put your salary ranges in good faith on all of your job postings. So whatever that good faith range looks like, it must be included on your job posting. Again, for anyone who may be operating in another state other than California, so, case in point, like Florida doesn't necessarily require you to do this. However, it is a really good thing, in my opinion, a great practice if you should. It has really great, in my opinion, has really great implications later on down the line in the hiring process. And also, it does a great job with aligning your job posting with the candidates that actually are a good fit for you most times. So, I highly encourage the pay transparency, no matter even if you're in California or in some other state. And then also anti-discrimination practices. Basically, don't discriminate, whether you're doing it intentionally or unintentionally. Make sure you're always governing yourself to not discriminate. Check your biases at the door is what I like to tell my clients, and just work through it if we can, right? We want to create as much of an anti-discriminatory process as possible. But then it also involves candidate vetting. So that actually means looking over resumes. That actually means talking to candidates, interviewing them, and actually seeing if this person is a good fit for your company. So that is a big part. Excuse me. Those are four big parts of the recruiting process. Next slide. So we talked about you need to have a job description, but what is a job description, right? A job description must be job related and accurate. It defines essential functions clearly. It includes physical, mental requirements. Now, this is a very big and important one. I will read over that one again. It includes physical and mental requirements, and ties everything back to the business entity. So, what does that mean? That means that you literally want to spell out every single thing that somebody would want to know about this job. All right. Is this person going to be lifting boxes that are more than 15 pounds? If so, make sure you put that on the job description. Is this person going to have to use a large portion of their brain, meaning that are they going to have to think a lot in order to do this job? Then we might want to include that on the requirement, on the job posting and in the job description as well. It's very important that we have that information stated up front so that person knows what it is that they're getting themselves into. And also, too, for you as the employer, you know exactly what you're holding that person accountable for, right? And also, as a good practice, I always recommend have that person and you sign that job description saying that, you know what, here's how I'm going to support you while you do this job. And here is, as the employee, you're saying that you're going to commit to doing this work here as it relates to this job description. So we definitely want to make sure we have those and make sure that we have that well spelled out as to exactly what that job is. Next slide. So before we move on, we're going to talk about and look through a job description. Other duties are giving me flashback. I get it. I really don't like when they put that on there. It's just an open-ended like thing, and it doesn't always go well, in my opinion. All right, so I'm going to give you, let's say, 60 seconds to look over this job description, and you're going to tell me whether or not you think that this is a compliant or not compliant job description. So 60 seconds. So go for it. So we'll come back and regroup, let's say at 4:50, 4:51. It's 4:51. So what do we think? Drop it in the chat or unmute yourself and tell me what you think. Is this a compliant job description? Do we see any physical or medical requirements on this job description? Do we see a rate of pay on this job description? Do we see any discriminatory language on this job description? Couple more seconds and then I'll give you the answer. All right, Miriam, could you hit next for me, please? This is not a compliant job descriptions for the reasons in which I just said. There's discriminatory language. Yes, you're correct, Reggie. There's discriminatory language. There's no pay rate. It just says competitive. What does that mean? Um, there's also no mention of the physical and mental requirements of the job. Those are things that are very important. And to dive a little bit deeper into that discriminatory language, right? It says, we're a fast-paced, high-energy company looking for a young, motivated individual to join our growing team. The word young can be discriminatory against a protected class of individuals. Do we know what protected class that is? Anyone that is of 40 years of age or older. So using such language like that may deter someone who may not consider themselves to be young, however we should choose to define that. And that can open up the company for liability, right? And we want to avoid that. So we want to be cognizant about the language in which we're using when we're putting together these job descriptions and how and try to be as neutral as possible. All right. Any questions before we move to the next one? All right, Miriam, could you hit next for me? All right. So you can obviously see this one has a little bit more information than the other one, but I'll give you 60 seconds. Go for it. We'll come back together, say at 4:54, and tell me what you think. Is it compliant or is it not compliant? All right. So what do we think? Is it compliant or is it not compliant? Is there a listed pay range? Does it talk about the mental and physical toll in which the job will take on the individual? Is there anything else that stands out that makes it a little bit different than the first one? All right. And you are correct. It is a compliant job description. It encompasses all the things in which we were talking about, right? Pay range. It uses neutral language. It talk about the physical abilities of the job, whether that person can lift 15 pounds or more. And also, too, there's an equal employment opportunity statement saying that we are promising that we won't discriminate as this towards anyone. So, and then we also have the candidate evaluation process, right? Not necessarily a requirement, but definitely good to have. All right, you can hit the next button, and it is compliant. All right, next slide. All right, pay transparency. So, pay transparency is required. All right, again, in different facets, but essentially, this applies to all employers with 15 or more employees in the state of California. If you have 15 or more employees in the state of California, you are required to post the pay range on job postings. And also, too, there are specific things around payroll that you must do as well. So we definitely want to keep that in front of mind. So as we are working on that job description, one of the things that I called out was, did we see the payment, excuse me, the rate of pay? And that was one of the determining factors between whether or not a job description is compliant or incompliant. And that also goes along with, and I must add this caveat, that applies only to employers with 15 or more. If you are an employer who has less than 15 employees, you are not required in the state of California to post the pay on the job posting. However, it is definitely a good practice, something I do highly recommend, something to do in good faith, even if it's not a requirement of you. Next slide. And anti-discrimination practices, again, as you're going through the hiring process, do your best to not discriminate. Even if it is direct or indirect, make sure that you're not doing so, right? Even if we use the job description as an example, while that individual who may have put that together may not have thought of putting the word young in there as being discriminatory, it is indeed discriminatory, right? Within our current administration, we're seeing that the EEOC are bringing forth a lot of interesting cases related to discrimination. So definitely something that we want to make sure that we stay on top of, so that way we can stay out of that particular issue, if that makes sense. So we want to make sure there's no discriminatory language in postings, no discriminatory language in job descriptions, no limiting applicant pools explicitly or indirectly, and recruiting channels must not exclude protected groups. So definitely something to keep in the back of our minds. All right, so we got a question here. Is pay transparency required after the hiring process? Yes, yes, it is. Pay transparency after the hiring process looks like specifically for payroll, right? So if in the state of California, if you go to your employer and say, hey, I would like to see the pay range for my position, they are required to provide you with the pay range for that role in the state of California. So pay transparency goes beyond the hiring process. It is also embedded into payroll and other aspects of the company as well. Next slide. All right. So this is where it gets fun. So this is a list of all the protected classes in California. I won't read through all of them, but essentially, California does provide some extra protection classifications. Uh, Excuse me, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. And so, at a federal level, there are particular protected classes. California has additional protected classes that go beyond that in which the federal level does, right? So this is something that we definitely want to keep in front of us and definitely keep in mind, knowing that these are all levels of protected classes, and in the work in which we're doing, especially creating those job descriptions, those job postings, we want to make sure to keep that neutral language. And again, unintentionally or intentionally, we don't want to necessarily discriminate against someone. And you know what, Danielle, to even make matters worse, right? So here in Oakland, well, I won't say worse, but to say that there are even more protected classes, Oakland City limits, or if you operate within Oakland City limits, there are additional protected classes as well for individuals who operate in the city of Oakland. So going back to in the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about the three different levels. You got federal, you got state, and you have municipality. In Oakland, under municipality ruling, there are some additional protected classes as well. So one of which we'll talk about a little bit later in the conversation as well. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I can share that information with you. They have a website, and I'm happy to share that with you and send that over. So I'll make a note to do that. Next slide. All right, candidate vetting. So, candidate vetting must focus on qualifications, competencies, and business needs. It apply so we apply screening criteria consistently across applicants, avoid subjective decision making, assumptions, or culture fit evaluations that may create bias. Structure interviews and documented scoring helps support fair and defensible hiring practices. And by defensible, that basically means if you ever should be called in the court of law and say, all right, why did you make the decision that you made? You want to be able to stand on that and say, here's why, here's the documents that prove why I made this decision and why this was the best decision for my company. Also, too, this is as we're moving to the age of AI, a lot of organizations are starting to incorporate AI screening tools as a part of their candidate vetting. As an employer, you are liable for discriminatory outcomes, even if the software causes it. So there was this whole issue last year with Workday and this lawsuit that came out where Workday was held liable for upholding discriminatory practices for the AI that they embedded into their system to help review resumes, right? That created a whole thing, intentional or unintentional. It created a bias for a group of individuals. So it was a black male who was over the age of 40 and had a disability. And I want to say there was one other factor that led to it. Basically brought a civil lawsuit against Workday. And then coming out of that, he won that lawsuit basically saying that the AI that Workday had created essentially was preventing him from being able to be employed. So intentional or not intentional, I know I keep saying it, but I want to drill it in, intentional or not, it is your responsibility as a business owner to make sure that the tools and the softwares that you're using are not creating any type of bias. All right, next slide. All right, so some of the things that we want to be consistent about in the hiring process. We want to be consistent about interviewing techniques. So, how are we interviewing these individuals? Are we asking behavioral questions? Are we asking, more situational questions? Like, or behavior and situational questions are the same thing, but you get the idea. But what are we doing, and how are we making sure that we're doing that consistently across the board for each candidate, right? And then also to interviewing questions per role. One of the things I recommend to my clients is create your questions before you go into the interview. Before you interview that first person, create a template and say, these are the 5 questions that I plan to ask as it relates to this role and that what I want to understand about this person to see whether or not they're a good fit. Template your questions, use that template for every candidate that you interview. Interviewing process, make sure that that is a consistent process. So even if you don't go with the sample process that I provided, you create your own process, make sure that you're going through the same process for each candidate. Don't do no one-offs. Just make sure that each person goes through it. Even if you're recommended a candidate from someone who you've known for years and you know they're trustworthy and you know they wouldn't send you a candidate that would not be worth your time, still take that person through the process. Do your due diligence. Don't open yourself up to any risk. Make sure that you're being consistent across the board. All right. Next slide. And going to those predetermined questions, right? So as you're creating that template, here are some sample questions that you can possibly ask, right? What previous roles have you held? What skills have you learned in previous roles? Which POS system have you used in previous roles? These questions allow for the person to talk about their skills, to talk about what they've learned along the way in their career, and it doesn't open the company up to any liability because these are neutral questions, right? They're related to the job. They're related to understanding what this person can and cannot do as it relates to the job. So just some sample questions that you can feel free to include on those templates if you would. Next slide. Avoid asking about salary history, criminal history, medical conditions, and protected class inquiries. So pay transparency does not, the Trade Transparency Act requires you to share whatever the salary requirements are for a role, but it does not require or does not allow for you to ask a candidate how much money they've made in previous roles, right? That is not, it doesn't give you that ability to do so. So keep that in mind. The criminal history, there's a specific place in the process where we talk about criminal history. You do not talk about criminal history in the vetting process. So if you're going through interviewing stages and you're talking about you're talking to this person and to get an understanding of whether or not they're going to be a good fit for this role, you don't ask about the criminal history. There's a later point in the process. We'll talk about if it should come up and if it isn't a need, if there's a need where you do talk about criminal history, but you do not do it in the beginning or during the interviewing phase. Medical conditions, again, one of those things don't want to ask about. If it comes up later on down the line, that's something that comes up. But ultimately, the goal is to just stick to how does this person align with the job description and being able to do the job that's needed. All right. And protected class inquiries, that's self-explanatory. Let's not, make any inquiries related to any protected classes. Let's make sure we use as much use neutral language as much as possible as we're going through the process. Next slide. All right. So one of the things that I also encourage my clients to do is to establish criteria. So that means a weighted scale, a weighted ranking. This is one of those ways in which you allow for there to be a fair process, right? It's fair. You don't have to worry about not weighing each candidate the same. So I always recommend going into it with the weighted rubric or criteria outline and using that for each candidate. And right here on the screen is just a sample of what that could look like, right? If it's someone who you're interviewing for a frontline role position, so say something like retail, again, going back to the idea of someone who can run that cash register for me, right? You're going to look at their customer service and communication, and then you're going to weigh that on a scale of 1 to 5. You're going to look at their reliability and dependability. So based off the questions, and how they perform in their interview, you're going to provide a weighted scale of what that looks like, right? And that, again, just fairness across the board, something I highly encourage, and something that I find that is defensible. If you should ever be approached or should ever have to go to the court of law and say, hey, I decided to go with this person over this person, you have the data to support why you made that decision. All right. Next slide. All right. Document decisions and processes. Going back to that last statement I just made, if you should ever get called into court, you just want to make sure that you have all the documents and everything that you need. By templating the interview questions, you know that you're going to be consistent in what it is that you're asking each candidate as it relates to the role. Document candidate responses. So as they are sharing information with you about their experiences and their desire to join the organization, make sure you're taking that down. Make sure you're writing that information so that way you can have it to reflect on and also justify why or why not that person was selected for the role, whatever that means, right? And maintain documentation in a secure location. Going back to our folders, we know that this is definitely information that we want to put into the folder, but we want to go into the correct folder. So make sure you're documenting as you're going through the process. Document, document, document. That's going to be a constant theme that we're here as we're moving through the training, but we want to make sure we're documenting as much as possible. Next slide. Oh, yes. And also keep in mind that anything that your work done as far as the hiring process goes can be called to the court of law as well. Next slide. And candidate accommodations. So one thing that I do want to note is that at any point during the interviewing phase or the vetting stages, a candidate can request an accommodation. right? So what that basically means is that person can say, "Hey, I may need to tailor this interview a little bit in order to accommodate my needs, whatever that means." What you want to do is establish an interactive process. So essentially, what that an interactive process is a process that allows for you to be able to work alongside that person to see what type of accommodation they might need, and whether or not you'll be able to actually accommodate them. So that is something to definitely keep in front of you to be compliant with ADA. At any point, a person can come and say, "Hey, I need an accommodation," and so long as that accommodation should not present a undue hardship to you as an employer, you must provide that accommodation. All right. Next slide. So, some examples of accommodations: providing a candidate with interview questions prior to conducting the interview. That's something that you can do. Let's say that someone says, "Hey, I'm really excited about interviewing for this job. However, I have a bit of anxiety. And as a way to quell my anxiety, I would like to know if you can send me those interview questions in advance," right? And if you already got your template put together, that's a no-brainer. You can send that information right on over to that person and allow for them to marinate over those questions before the interview. Also, to another simple way to, not simple, but excuse me, another way in which you can provide an accommodation is to allow the candidate to interview remotely, whether that's via Zoom, Google Meet, FaceTime, or whatnot. Those are things that you can do in order to help a candidate out to be able to interview with you for the role. Hopefully that makes sense. And next slide. All right, we're going to do a quick true and false. So, pay transparency applies to employers with fewer than 14 employees. True or false? All right. Any others? All right. And you would be correct. The answer is false. Pay transparency does not apply to employers with fewer than 14 employees, right? It applies to any employer that has 15 or more. An employer is not at fault for third-party vendor AI bias. True or false? All right. False. Any others? Give it a couple seconds. And the answer is false. An employer is at fault for third-party vendor AI bias. Remember that scenario we were talking about Workday, right? And all of that. So even though Workday was the one that was sued in the lawsuit, those employers which use that software that open themselves up to liability because it is the responsibility of the employer to make sure that the systems and tools in which we're using do not create bias. So even though it wasn't there, even though the whoever that employer was that used that system, even though it is not their proprietary system, because they employed that system within their organization, they are held liable. Hopefully that makes sense. It's illegal to discriminate based on an individual's family and relationship structure. True or false? Okay. Okay. I got a true, true. All right. A couple more seconds just to see. And this is a trick one, actually. This is a trick question. So remember we were talking about Oakland having some additional protected classes? This is one of those additional protected classes. While not protected on a federal or state level, if a employer operates within Oakland city limits, they cannot discriminate against someone based off their family and relationship structure. So, in layman's term, what that means is you can't discriminate against someone who's in a polyamorous relationship. So, that is a specific protection that is afforded to individuals in the city of Oakland. So, the answer to this would be true. You cannot discriminate, but that only applies to Oakland. It doesn't apply on a federal level, and it does not apply on a state level. Does that make sense to everyone? And again, this just goes back to show how that compliance and how these extra protections and things really come into play based off where your organization is operating out of. All right. And next slide. All right. So those key areas of hiring. So we've talked about this a lot, talking about the hiring process and everything. So these are some areas that we definitely want to keep in front of us too. Those conditional job offers. So what is a conditional job offer? All right, so let's say that person that you were looking to hire for your to run that cash register for you at the retail shop that you have, right? You've gone through the interview process, you found someone that you think will be an excellent fit for this job, right? What you're going to do now is make them a conditional job offer. So basically, you're going to say, hey, based off these terms, which usually means the successful passing of background screenings and any other screenings that are related to the job. If you should pass all these screenings and you should do good and we should be able to come to an agreement, I'm going to offer you a job and here's the rate I'm going to offer. Here's the start date, all that good jazz, right? You've made that person a conditional offer to say that I'm going to employ you so long as we are good to go. Should there be any additional screenings necessary, right? That is an important step because that is where then you're transitioning from vetting this candidate to now trying to employ this person, right? So remember early on in the conversation, we were talking about criminal history, background, and all that things, right? In the vetting process, when you're interviewing someone, you cannot bring that information up. However, now that you've made this conditional offer, the vetting process is over, and now we're moving into the possibility of this person actually being employed at your organization. So now that we've transitioned over to this person actually possibly being employed at your organization, now you're going to start the process of actually doing background or any employment verification screenings or things like that. So then we're going to go from conditional, so we're going to make that conditional offer, then we're going to go into background screenings, right? And then also too, some of the things that we want to keep in front of us, and we'll talk a little bit about is the Fair Chance Act obligations. What are our obligations under that? What are our obligations under background screening compliance, right? We're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. And also, too, we want to make sure that we are documenting consistently. So as we're going through this process in the hiring, vetting, all of that, right? We want to make sure we keep that documentation consistent. And then we're also going to want to make sure we have a proper offer letter, right? So we made a conditional job offer, but then also, too, we're going to want to have a proper offer letter as well on file. And then we're going to want to make sure that we have that hiring record retentions are accurate as well. So these are 6 areas that we really, really want to make sure that we're paying attention to as we're going through the hiring process. Next slide. So, just a little bit about that conditional job offer. A conditional job offer of employment is based on successful completion of pre-employment requirements. So, again, that can be background checks, reference checks, and even post-offer screenings. So, those are different things that are based off that conditional offer. Next slide. Background screening. So an employer must obtain a written authorization. So before you even background screen someone, you need to make sure that you have authorization from that person to do so. One of the things that I recommend to take some of the liability off of my clients is to really just get with a really reputable background check vendor, and usually they'll have a lot of these things already in play. And of course, it's important for you to know this information. Again, you have to govern your vendor as well. But ultimately, I have found in my practice when I partner with some of the background screening vendors that they're pretty good about having the written authorizations and any other legal information that I may need from a background standpoint. So definitely wanting to make sure that you have that authorization, getting the correct language that you need the individual to sign so they can authorize you to perform a background screening. And then you also want to follow the federal and California screening laws. There are some specifics around it. In California, there are some specifics around drug screening, right? It's very specific around what type of drug screening tools you can use in order to drug screen someone. One of my clients that I've worked with, they were using the incorrect drug screening tools. And so when it came down to an actual suit, and someone said, hey, they discriminated against me because I'm a marijuana consumer. And fun fact in California, you cannot be discriminated against for consuming marijuana offside the clock, right? Well, my client discriminated against this person for it because the test came back positive. And California said, no, you must bring that person back because you used the wrong tool. Now, granted, I also should say that. Well, no, leave it there. Yep, that person we did wind up having to bring back into the organization, but essentially, it's very important to understand what those regulations are and what they look like for where you operate. You also want to protect candidate privacy. Use job-related screening criteria. So you should only be screening for things that are related to the job and the job description. Next slide. So just some examples of some other type of pre-employment screenings. So again, background, drug screening, DOT physical exam. So DOT is the Department of Transportation. So you see this a lot in the trucking industry and other industries where there's requirement of special licensures, right? There's a physical exam in which these operators must take. And so that is also a part of the pre-employment screening. Security clearances, this relates to, a job where security or government clearances or things may be needed. Those are some things that also may be pre-employment screening as well. Next slide. So let's say that that person that you made that offer to, and you've gone and done that person's background check. But the background check came back and said there's an adverse action. Something was flagged. What do you do? Do you say, all right, well, this person is no longer fit to work at my company. We're just going to move on and I'm going to go with candidate number two? Or do you have a conversation with that person? The latter, you have a conversation with that person. So one thing that you're going to want to do is provide that candidate with a notice. Hey, I just want to let you know we got your background results and this is what came up on the background result. And then two, what you're going to do is you're going to provide that person with a copy of those results. All right, so here's those results. This is what came up. I just want to share it with you, what I saw, and just so that you can see it, so that way we can understand and be on the same page. This is what, this is the information that's been provided to me. I highly encourage, after you gave that person that notice and provided them with the report, also provide them with an opportunity to respond. So what that means is, all right, you've shared with this person, this is what came back to me, this is what I got. I want to show you a copy of it. Do you have anything that you want to say regarding this matter? Is there anything that maybe I'm not aware of that you can shed light on that can help me in my decision-making process, right? Those are things that help with making sure that you're providing a fair opportunity for that candidate, right? Not dismissing them first off the bat just because, oh man, this was flagged. All right, cool. We're just gonna move on to the next. No, what you want to do is give that person an opportunity to respond. I can honestly say there have been situations where I've worked with employees who were flagged for something that was inaccurate, right? The government system said that this person was a coyote, essentially smuggling people across the border. Come to find out, that was not true. That person didn't have a record at all. And somehow, some way, though, this government system said that this person did that. If I would have reacted instantly, I would have said no to this person's employment. But after having that conversation with them, and also after getting a confirmation legally and everything that this was not a thing and that that system was wrong, I was able to move forward with that person's employment, right? So it's a very great practice to provide that person an opportunity to give a response and actually work through, because sometimes everything is not what it seems, is the best way to put it. And all right. And next slide. So the California Fair Chance requirements. Again, we were just talking about this a little bit, going through that process. In California, there's a fair chance requirement. So giving that person an opportunity to respond, giving that person an opportunity to shed light on exactly what's going on and what happened, you're giving that person a fair chance with to employment. And that is something that we do encourage, and also something that is required under California Fair Chance laws. Next slide. All right. So now let's say that, all right, that's over with. You've had that conversation with this person about that background screening that came in, and you decided that, you know what, this person's still the best fit for this job. So we're just going to keep chucking along and we're going to make this work, right? So now, one of the things that you want to do is make sure that you've documented everything that's happened up to this point, because if it ever comes back out, let's say something happens and you have to defend your decision to move forward with this person, or you should have to defend why you may not have chosen to move forward with this person for whatever reason, right? You want to make sure you have as much information documented and make sure that the decision that you made is defensible, and it's defensible as it relates to the job, the interview performance, and any consistent hiring standards that you may have at your organization. If it is not tied to the job description, it should not drive the hiring decision. That is something that I believe, something to share. Make sure that it's related to the job description when you're making those defensible arguments, saying that I did this in good faith based off XYZ. Next slide. One of the things we want to avoid in this process when we're trying to say that we can, excuse me, one of the things that we want to avoid when making these decisions is gut feelings, right? We only want to go off the facts. We want to go off of that criteria that we set earlier, that weighted scale. We don't necessarily want to say, well, I feel like this person would be great. We want to be able to say that we have data to show that this person would be great at the job. Informal preferences and inconsistent interviewing processes. We talked about that a little bit. We just want to make sure that we're being as consistent as possible and make sure we're documenting as much information as possible as we're going through the process. Next slide. So reduce your negligent hiring risk, verify qualifications where appropriate. So again, going back to, if we're going through the screening process, if that person has some education as it relates to the job. So let's say we are hiring a lawyer, right, for a company. One of the screening processes that we're going to do is we're going to look and make sure that that person graduated where they actually say they graduated from, right? We're going to look and make sure that that person is a actual licensed and practicing attorney in the jurisdiction in which they're applying for, right? Those are things that are part of that screening process that we definitely want to do. And so to reduce the negligent hiring risk, we just want to make sure we do those proper screenings. Going back to confirming job-related experiences and document hiring rationale. Again, just document, document, document. Next slide. And the offer letter matters, right? So something to keep in front of you when you're putting together those offer letters. These are the 6 areas, 6 areas that are important and that should be included on all offer letters that you make. You should have a start date, the title in which the person has been awarded or the person has been employed for, compensation, employment classification. So again, is this person full-time, part-time, and work expectations. So sometimes that can be something as simple as outlining the core responsibilities of the role on the offer letter, if you should. And then also at-will employment language. I want to say, if I recall correctly, the majority of this, with the exception of one state, has at-will employment. So California definitely being one of those states where at-will employment is things. So definitely want to make sure you have some language around that and the offer letter as well. So that way that individual knows exactly what they're getting themselves into as far as employment with your organization. All right. I know that we are at 5:30 and we still have a couple more things to go through. And I just want to see if everyone's okay with going a little bit over, or if we feel as though that maybe we need to get together again to go over a little bit more things. Feeling good? Thumbs up if we're feeling good and want to keep going. All right. All right. We'll keep chugging along. All right. Next slide. So, some records that you should retain. So again, we're bringing all of this information full circle, right? We're talking about those folders, talking about those files. This is going to be a common theme as we continue to have the conversation. Records employers should retain, so you should retain the application. Interview notes, candidate scorecards. That card could be something like the criteria sheet that we talked about a little bit earlier. Hiring criteria, and offer letters, right? Those are things that we definitely want to make sure that we have in those employee files, and also background screening documentation. We want to make sure we retain those documents should we need to refer back to them later on down the line. Next slide. All right. And so we're going to do a quick pop quiz. Are you ready? So, which folder should you keep interviewing and hired records in? Feel free to drop the answer in the chat or come off mute. Where should you put these records? Where should they go? Which folder? Bring everything full circle. Okay. Employment eligibility verification. All right. Any others? All right. Couple more seconds. All right. And the correct answer is A. Personnel files, employee records, and performance. Um, so interviewing and hire records are all a part of the employee records in that person's performance. That's the only place that you would want to keep those documents so that they can be referred back to should they need to. The employment eligibility verification, that is only for I-9 documents. The only documents that should go in there are for I-9 and employment verification, such as visa related employees and things of that nature. All right, next slide. All right. So we're coming up on company policies. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. So far, we've talked about the hiring process. We've talked about the employee classifications, the difference between an independent contractor and an employee. We've talked about it a lot, but what we haven't talked about yet is company policies. What is that? Have we ever heard of a company policy? Of course we have. All right. Next slide. Policies aren't just rules, they're risk management tools. So one of the things to think about when you're in the mindset of policies, policies create consistency. Policies clarify expectations. Policies help defend employment decisions. Policy reduce conflict and liability. These are all the benefits to having policies. Um, Sometimes it can be a little bit laborious to put all these policies in place. However, they're your best friend should you ever need to refer back to them. And as we have the conversation today, you'll see some examples where policies will come into play and help benefit the organization. Next slide. So, when we talk about policies, we're going to talk about it in the perspective of risk. We're going to look at it from five different risk area. So, the first area being hiring, the second area being pay practices, the third being leaves and accommodations, conduct and safety, and documenting. And documenting is in the center because it's the core of all of these things. So it's the core to the core, right? If you would. So documenting is a big part of a lot of things that we do. As you can see, I've mentioned documenting a lot and saying how to document, where to document. It is something that comes up a lot when we're looking at our HR practices. All right, next slide. All right, so first risk area number one, hiring practices. So I'm going to take a step back because I didn't explain something. So I'm going to explain this too, as how we're actually going to look at this and how the information is going to be presented to you on the slides, right? So we're talking about policies and practices and recommendations in which I recommend that you have in order to cover these five risk areas, right? And so within that, some of these things we've already talked about, so I won't necessarily beat it over the head, but we'll talk about how having these things lowers your risk opportunity so that way you're not opening yourself up for any possible liabilities, right? And so we're going to do that in the mention of actual policy titles, but we probably won't have the chance to go through individual policies themselves, but just we'll go through them in title and I'll give you a little bit of description and describe what that represents for some of them. Okay. So, risk area number one in hiring practices. It is a risk not to have job descriptions, to not participate in pay transparency, background screenings, candidate evaluation standards, AI hiring practices, equal employment, and those are things and those are areas which we want to make sure that we have clear policies and clear procedures that have been outlined to say that this is how we look at it and this is what we're going to do when it comes to this, right? Job description, self-explanatory. What you really want is just a document that says this is what the job is and this is what the requirements are of you to the requirements of you in order to perform this job, right? So that's what that pay transparency. We talked about that a little bit. Definitely a risk area if you are 15 or more employees in the state of California. Background screening. We talked about what that looks like. Candidate evaluation standards. Just be consistent. Be consistent across the board. If you do it for one candidate, do it for all. Right. That's the best way to look at it. Then also equal employment opportunity. And also AI, we talked about AI a little bit, but equal employment opportunity, definitely a great practice to have a policy or procedure to say that as a company or organization, this is how we are ensuring that we are being an equal opportunity employer, if you would, right? So in order to avoid these risks as it relates to hiring practices, these are the things in which I recommend, and these are the type of policies and practices that I recommend that you have in play. All right, next slide. Risk area number two, wage and hour practices. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. Most employment claims involve wage and hour issues, specifically here in the state of California. So how do you lower the risk of having issues with employees or with state agencies? Excuse me, you have these policies in place, timekeeping procedures. How are you keeping up with time cards, time system? How are you making sure that you're having an accurate reflection of the time in which that individual worked, right? What are you doing as an organization in order to make sure that the time in which someone said they worked, they are actually being compensated for and they actually worked, right? Meal and rest break policy. This is a big one here in California, right? I've seen a lot of my clients, go up against state agencies when it specifically comes to meal and rest breaks, right? Sometimes when we're in the thick of work, and I'm guilty of it myself, I can say it's like sometimes my spare time I bartend, right? And when I bartend, there are times where it gets busy. And when it's time for me to take my break because it's busy, I totally forget to take my break, right? And then next thing you know, I've gone my whole entire shift and I have not taken a break. That is a bad thing. The California state law, there are required breaks based off the amount of time an individual works, right? So if an individual works more than 5 hours, they must have a mandatory 30-minute break. If it goes beyond 5 hours to 6 and 7 and beyond, there are additional 10-minute breaks that must be granted to that person as well. So it's very important to make sure that you have those policies and those procedures in place as it relates to meal and rest breaks, so that way you can make sure that you're governing and not opening yourself up to liability and the possibility of some of your employees not actually taking those meal and rest breaks. Overtime authorization. How are you authorizing if someone works overtime? Those are things that you want to make sure that you keep a pulse on as well. Off the clock work prohibitions. There are certain standards and certain practices that you want to govern. I know I used to work for a enterprise, and one of the things working at that enterprise was you do not reflect badly upon them. If you do, that is grounds for termination. And so if those are things that you uphold at your company and that you can justify as being a reasonable issue to uphold, I guess you could say, for the lack of better words, then you would want to make sure that you have an off the clock work prohibition, like policy, if you would. And expense reimbursement and payroll corrections. Those are definitely things you want to be able to say, I have a procedure around if you should. Again, going back to wage and hour practices. If someone looks at a paycheck and they say, well, I was short an hour or two and I need to do that, you want to make sure that you can do whatever's necessary to make those corrections expeditiously, because there are payroll laws that go around how soon an employee must receive payment after performing the work. So there is some laws and things around that. So make sure that you have a process in place to be able to remain compliant. Next slide. All right, risk area number three, leave and accommodation. Policies and practices to have, right? So again, talking about leave and accommodations, I know we talked about the folder, but now what policies and practices should you have around leaves and accommodation requests? Paid sick leave. If you are an employer that is subjected to paid sick leave, make sure that you have a policy and a practice in place for that. If you're subjected to jury duty leave, make sure you have a policy and in place for that, right? Fun story. I had a client down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and excuse me, not Fort Lauderdale, but Miami, Florida, and they were in what is called Miami-Dade County. Miami-Dade County has specific jury duty leave laws that the state of Florida doesn't have. So, as an operator down in Miami-Dade, you have to be compliant with those jury duty leave laws and requirements. So, this is where that jury duty leave policy and practices come into play. And again, going back to compliance and how it relates to different municipalities, and that specific municipality being Miami-Dade. Voting leave, while there isn't a federal voting leave, states like California and other states, there are requirements for voting and being able to provide time for individuals to go and vote. So make sure that you understand what that is and what that looks like as well. And then again, just some other ones, military accommodation process. So for the accommodation process, make sure you just have an interactive process. So if someone needs to request an accommodation, make sure there's a process that's outlined that says, these are the steps in which you need to take. This is the person that you need to go to. This is the information that we'll probably request. Just giving that information out a little bit early, so that way if an individual needs to participate in an interactive process or an accommodation process, they know exactly what is expected of them. And same goes for pregnancy accommodation, CFRA, which is the California Family Rights Act, and FMLA, which is the Family Medical Leave Act. There are specific requirements around that too as well. So make sure you have your policies and procedures in place so that way you can lower the risk as well. Next slide. And risk area number four, workplace conduct and safety. So one of the things I want to lead the conversation with is, in the state of California, safety includes physical and psychological safety, harassment prevention, and reporting procedures, right? That's a difference from some other states in the nation, right? California is very big on making sure that not only are we protecting the physical well-being of the employees, but we're also protecting the psychological well-being of those employees. Perfect example when we look at job descriptions, right? One of the things that we kept talking about, physical and mental demand that the job has on that individual, making sure that's upfront, making sure that person knows what they're getting themselves into. Similarly here, that's exactly what is being asked, is making sure that we take into consideration that safety is not only physical, but it is psychological and preventative. So, some policies and practices you want to have in place are some anti-harassment, anti-discrimination, um, compliant reporting, workplace violence prevention, injury and illness prevention, technology, AI uses, drug and alcohol. Those are definitely some policies that you want to have in play to be able to set a standard for what type of organization is and what it is that is allowed at this organization and how this organization behaves and what is it that the organization believes in, right? And making sure that we're looking at all of those various protected classes. All right. And also, too, a big one for the technology and AI usage, specifically here in the state of California, there are laws that came out, I want to say last year or the year before last. I feel like last year, though, that are specific to AI usage. How does your company use AI, right? There are laws that says that if you use AI in this way or use AI in that way, you are subjected to these laws. So definitely, depending on the industry and the areas in which you practice, as far as your company goes, making sure that you have those technology and AI usage laws and policies in place is very important as well to lower that risk. All right. Any questions or how are we feeling? Doing pretty good. Thumbs up if everyone's still here. Thumbs down if you're asleep. All right. Everyone's snoozing. It's okay. We'll keep chucking along. All right. Next slide. All right, so risk area number five in that final risk area, documentation and record keeping, right? Again, one of the things that I would say in HR is if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Well, granted, we know that's not true, but for simplicity perspective, document, right? We want to document everything that's happening. We want to make sure that we have records to fall back on. If there's anything, if there's anything that happens or that goes awry and someone says, well, you know what? I just need to understand, you can always go back to your documentations and say, well, here's what happened. And here's the documentation that I have to prove that this is what happened, right? So always make sure that you have your documentations and that you're keeping your records as accurate as possible. So again, we talked about those personnel files, procedures, what goes in. So procedurally speaking, what goes in that file? Who has access to that file? Is that file accurate? Is everything that needs to be in there is there? Like we want to make sure that that's happening, especially when it comes to personnel files or any files for that matter, right? So that includes your medical files, payroll records, I-9. And then also too, one of the things that I encourage my clients, if you don't have a handbook, get you a handbook sooner than later, right? Because one of the things that you want to do is start getting your employees to acknowledging the handbook, because then in that handbook, it has all your policies, has all your procedures. Once that person has acknowledged, you can definitively say that you can hold that person accountable for whatever is in the handbook, right? So long as it's legal, moral, and ethical, you can uphold that person performance as it relates to their job and the handbook. And again, we want to make sure that we're documenting the interview, defending our decisions, whatever that means, and making sure that we have all the performance documents that we need as well. And when it comes to performance documents, the goal is never to just document what's bad, but to also document the good as well. We want to celebrate wins just as much as we celebrate realigning those individuals to the expectations. All right. Next slide. Here's a question for the group. If a state agency requested your records tomorrow, would your business be ready? Would you be ready if someone said, hey, I want to take a look at all of your I-9 documents? If someone said, you know what, this in person just filed for unemployment, right? Do you have records to prove why this person is no longer at your company? Would you be ready for that? And the reason I ask that question is because more times than not, sometimes we feel like we aren't, sometimes we feel like we are. I think in this juncture, what's important is to know what it is that you need to know in order to make sure that you are ready should someone come knocking at your door tomorrow, right? Because you never know. You never know what may happen. So it's better to be prepared than not be prepared. Next slide. So, all right, now I didn't talk to you about all of these policies and how you should have these policies, but where do you start? You're a small business owner. Like, where do you actually start in all of this? First thing you want to do, get your written handbook. Just put together a handbook. It doesn't have to be 200 pages. It doesn't have to be 50 pages. It may not even have to be 20 pages, depending on, your organization. But the goal is to have a place that has all of your policies and procedures that are written, documented, and acknowledged by both yourself as the owner of the business and also to that individual who is an employee at the business. Making sure that everyone can have a reference to go back to say, you know what, if something happens, all right, what's our process for this? If I need to request an accommodation, I can go to the handbook and say, all right, this is how I'm going to do that. So it's very important to make sure you have that handbook and make sure you have the acknowledgement of the handbook as well. Wage and hour compliance. Again, California, one of the biggest things that we see here in California, most employers have issue because of wage and hours, due to wage and hour, right? So make sure that you're being compliant with that. Proper documentation systems. Make sure you're documenting everything that's happening while it's happening. Hiring consistency and leaves and accommodation procedures. Those are your top 5 areas that we really want to tackle when you're a small business when it comes to the policy and making sure that you have those policies and procedures in place. All right. Next slide. So we talked about the policies, right? We talked about the policies you need. But there's one important thing we haven't touched on yet. Policies they only work when they're reinforced. I have seen where organizations will write down a policy, create a handbook, and don't stick to it, right? Just totally throws it out the window. They did it because it was a requirement for whatever reason. They did it because they felt as though they needed it, but no one actually upholds the policies. No one actually trains the policies. No one is actually being consistent with the policies. It is equally as important to have the policies. It is equally as important to teach the policies, communicate the policies, and apply the policy as it is to having it. So having a handbook and having your individual employees to acknowledge it is not enough. You have to be able to communicate that. You have to be able to train it. You have to be able to model it in the workplace, especially as the owner of the company. You want to model that policy or that procedure, whatever that means. And you want to regularly review them. Take a look at it. All right, we created a handbook, let's say 6 months ago, right? And things have changed. Laws have changed. Our government has said that, we're going to start doing XYZ now. That means that our policies need to be updated. That means our procedures need to be updated. So making sure that we're regularly reviewing them and make sure that we're updating them as the laws change is equally as important as actually having the policies in place. Next slide. All right. And again, just going back over how reinforcing policies effectively. And again, we go back to the employee handbook acknowledgement, supervisor training, new hire onboarding, annual policy refresher, consistent documentation. All of these things are examples of ways in which you can continue to reinforce those policies, right? Supervisor training. So let's say you're the owner of a coffee shop, right? And at this coffee shop, you have 10 employees. Of those 10 employees, one of them is a supervisor who manages the business when you're not there. Have you trained that individual on your policies and perspectives from a supervisory level? Not necessarily just as an employee, but as a supervisor. So, as a supervisor, this is my expectations of how you are to uphold this policy. Here's my expectation for you to do X, Y, Z. That is equally as important as well, right? Making sure that your supervisors, your leaders at your organization also understand what does it mean to reinforce, uphold, and model the policies and the procedures that are in place. Also, too, great thing to do as soon as you've hired that person out to your company, onboard them. During that onboarding conversation, what are you talking about? You're talking about your policies and your procedures. You're talking about how we're going to uphold this. You're going to talk about the expectations. These are ways in which you can continue to reinforce your policies effectively. Next slide. All right. Again, this is just a little blurb. Policies protect businesses. Workplaces protect practices reinforce policies. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Policies are there to protect the business. They're there to make sure that if you ever needed to defend the business and your practices and your actions, you can do so. Next slide. All right, so we're going to go through a scenario really quickly, right? So we got two scenarios, and we're going to have a conversation around the scenario based off policies. So the first scenario is a micro bakery with 12 employees has operated for years without an employee handbook. A newly hired supervisor recently handled an employee complaint differently, than the owner handled a similar issue a few months earlier. When approached by concerned employees, the owners responded, "We're a small company. We handle things case by case." Let that marinate. Next slide. So we're going to have a discussion around that. What risks do we see in this scenario? So this is a micro bakery. They have 12 employees. They've operated years without a handbook. A new supervisor just came in, and there was a concern amongst the employees. The way that the supervisor handled it isn't the way that the owner would have handled it, and now the employees have an issue. What risks do we see here? Are there any? Give you a couple seconds. Give you till 5:58. How about that? Marinate on that. And also feel free if you want to jump the gun and go ahead and read the other questions, feel free to. We'll go through them. But yeah. All right, no worries. So we'll go through this. Inconsistent and discipline can cause favoritism. That is correct. That is a great explanation, Demetrius. There isn't clear guidance for any role on how to handle the situation. That is also correct, right? And that all kind of bleeds into what we were talking about here. So one of the things that we really want to just share, that I really want to share here, is that because there's inconsistencies, because the policies are not being followed. Yeah, there may be a handbook out there somewhere, but because it's inconsistent, it opens up the company to risk. So I'm going to have to end the conversation here. There was one area that we didn't get necessarily to touch on. However, I'm going to send out this presentation to everyone, so that way you can see a little bit more about performance management, right? And so I'll leave you with this. Many small businesses operate informally for years without issues. Policies help create alignment, fairness, document standards before problems arise. Right. So definitely we want to be in the habit of being more preventative than we are reactive. So this is how we can be a little bit more a little bit more proactive by making sure that we have these policies and procedures into play. I want to thank you for taking the time to hang out with me and Miriam today and learn a little bit more. I hope there was some valuable information gained here. And obviously, feel free. You can always reach out to me if you ever want to talk a little bit more and a little bit deeper about some of the things in which we discussed today. But I do appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to really just come and hang out with us and learn a little bit more. And hopefully, in the future, we'll have more opportunities like this. But yeah. Thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Ronkevious, for sharing so much great information today. The video recording and the slide deck will be sent out along with a link to your website to the participants and to everybody who registered, and we'll get it up on our YouTube in time. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Have a great day. Bye.